All right, it's 11:16. Let's begin. And I would like to welcome everyone to the CMMC Scoping 101, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, a strategic approach to CMMC certification. We will be talking today about a component of the CMMC requirement that is often missed or simply overlooked, and yet it is a critical step all defense industrial base contractors need to take in the process of becoming compliant with the DFARS requirements and acquiring a CMMC certification. The topics we will be discussing today is what is scoping about, and more importantly, why does it matter? We will provide you with a comprehensive guide on the key components and details of a CMMC scoping guide, equipping you with the knowledge to navigate the scoping process effectively. We will also give you some practical tips for identifying and managing your scope, as well as leveraging the CMMC scoping guide to minimize their certification burden. And before we'll start, I just want to let you know that nothing in this presentation is a legal advice or should be construed as endorsement of any solution, product, service, or methodology. So CONNSTEP, just a few words about CONNSTEP. We are the Connecticut MEP Center, which is the manufacturer extension partner. We are part of a national network that is sponsored and facilitated by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which means that there is an MEP Center in each state throughout the United States. And there are many benefits of being part of a national network. We collaborate together, we exchange best practices, and we share information, especially the information that is being passed to us from the NIST itself. We also have access to over 1,300 consultants nationwide and their expertise. So I am very excited today to have Mark join us on this webinar. Mark, if you could just take a few moments to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, your expertise.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. My name is Mark Misone. I'm the CTO of DataSure 24. We are a security organization, security provider, providing consulting for CMMC and for really any other type of security needs. In terms of CMMC, I am a registered practitioner. I'm a certified assessor. I'm also a certified instructor. So I actually train the assessors, the people that are going for their CCA or their CCP certifications. I actually train the required DoD certification training for it. So I've been involved with CMMC since day one, and I also have over 22 years of federal experience working with various agencies in terms of their assessments, making sure either the agencies or those contractors are meeting various security requirements. So I've been through a lot.
Awesome, thank you. And maybe a little bit about me. My name is Anna Mumford. I am the cybersecurity consultant at CONNSTEP. For the past 5 years, I have been working with small and medium-sized manufacturers right here in Connecticut, assisting them with regulatory cybersecurity compliance assessments and guiding their implementation. I usually work with the company's leadership team as well as their IT resources, whether they are internal or external, to guide the company, their cybersecurity compliance initiatives. I'm also certified CMMC registered practitioners and currently working on the CMMC assessor certification. And a fun fact about me, just last November, I graduated with my master's degree in cybersecurity management from Purdue University. So I'm newly minted. Perfect. So let's jump right in. In 2022, the manufacturing sector became a #1 attack for number one target for cybersecurity attacks, accounting for nearly 25% of all cyber attacks across all industries worldwide. And in response, over the last several years, the federal government and the Department of Defense have been implementing a series of cybersecurity requirements and regulations for the defense industrial base, the DIB sector contractors. And with the goal to diminish the threat while protecting the safety and security of our nations and the ability of our country to defend itself. So those regulations require the implementation of cybersecurity practices to protect the controlled and classified DoD information that reside on the contractor's systems in all tiers of their supply chain. The CMMC rule, but just by the way, has been published last Friday in the Federal Register as the final CMMC rule, provides verification mechanisms to certify that the security requirements to protect the controlled and classified DoD information have been implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcomes. Now, what's important to understand in here is that those requirements are data-centric. Therefore, it is critical to understand the landscape of where this information resides, how it is used, or how it is transmitted within and between the contractor's environment. So prior to conducting a CMMC assessment, the contractor must specify the CMMC assessment scope, which defines all of the assets within the contractor's environment that will be assessed against the CMMC requirements. This means that scoping is a data-centric activity that will identify or determine those assets, the people, the facilities, and technology within the contractor's environment that interact with the sensitive DoD information and therefore will be targeted or within scope for the CMMC assessment. And determining the boundaries of what is in scope for a CMMC assessment or identifying every asset in the contractors that the contractor needs to protect ensures that we don't waste resources building up security on systems that really don't need it. Scoping also helps organizations to optimize how they might redesign their systems and business processes to limit the scope when possible, and therefore limiting the implementation cost, effectively focusing on allocation of the resources and improving security by reducing the overall attack surface. And of course, scoping benefits the contractors as it streamlines their journey towards achieving the CMMC compliant certification. I'm going to pass this to Mark.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the core aspects of the CMMC Level 2 Scoping Guide. Now, if you go, and I think in the chat, they're going to be posting the location where the Cyber AB has a scoping guide and other documentation that is really important for CMMC. It has a scoping guide. Whoops. Hold on. My mouse went a little. All right. It's got the scoping guide, assessment guides, a mile guides, a whole bunch of other documentation by the DoD. So it's very important to understand them and to go through them. When it comes to scoping and the scoping guides, as Anna mentioned, and I tell my assessor students and other OSCs and other contractors, when it comes to scoping, as far as I'm concerned, scoping is probably the most important thing to a contractor that essentially is going to make or break whether you actually get CMMC certification or not, which is very, interesting because a lot of people think, well, I need to, complying with the requirements would people think that, that's the most important, but it really isn't. It's scoping, because if you're able to take stuff out of scope, you don't need to meet requirements. And that's why scoping is so important. So there are two scoping guides. There's the CMMC assessment scoping guide for level 1, and it has the requirements for scoping for level 1 self certification. One of the things to understand when it comes to the scoping is a required activity before either a self-assessment for level 1 or a third-party assessment for level 2. So that is a prerequisite to an actual certification. Now, the scoping guide for level 2, there are a few additional requirements which I'm going to be talking about now. Number one, the assets, as part of scoping, the assets need to be categorized. So there are certain categorizations of individual assets. It's not, here is all my CMMC stuff. No, every asset needs to be categorized and being given an asset type. Now, when it comes to scoping, what we're essentially doing is we're pretty much drawing a box around a part of our environment that we are going to get assessed and get CMMC certification. One of the misunderstandings people have had for a long time now is when organizations think about CMMC certification, I think they mistakenly think it's their organization needs to be certified. No, it's what's in their scope. And pretty much an organization can draw a box around anything they want, however big or small that they want. So the scoping guide talks about these assets must be categorized, and there are 5 CMMC asset categories. So I'll get to that now. Now, the other thing is the scope is initially proposed by the contractor. So when you're going in and getting an actual certification assessment, it's not the case of the assessor comes in and determines your scope. No, you're going to draw, as a contractor, you're going to draw a box around anything you want. And you're essentially going to the assessor and saying, give me a stamp of approval on this box I drew. So the scoping really is initially proposed and determined by the contractor itself. And the contractor essentially will say, I want this thing certified for CMMC. And then from there, it's kind of a negotiation involving those assets and the contractor's initial determination of the scope and the assessor's validation of the scope. So when you get, if you sign up for a CMMC certification assessment, now again, the assessor isn't going to determine your scope, but they're going to probably go in and at least validate your scope. They're going to validate and say, okay, what you're proposing to be your scope, I'm okay with. The other option is the assessor may not be okay with it. And again, it might be a negotiation. Maybe the assessor may say, you know what, I think this additional asset should be in scope. And it's really up to the contractor to agree and put it in scope, or maybe talk the assessor and explain to the assessor why they feel it shouldn't be in scope. But in the end, it's this negotiation where they both need to agree on that final scope. But it really is up to the contractor in the end to do that determination as far as what's in scope and what's not. Because of that, some contractors may want to hire a third-party expert to help them determine that scope. Where that box is again extremely critical. And also to identify strategic ways to limit the scope that's going to help reduce costs and the overall attack surface. So, one of the benefits that Anna had mentioned earlier to limiting scope is you don't want to spend your money and your resources and your time protecting systems that don't need to be protected. That's one of the huge benefits by limiting scope. And so we can either scope things out or prepare parts of the environment that are in scope to meet those CMMC requirements. So generally speaking, a very, very high level process for scoping is, first off, you want to inventory all of your systems. So I know I talked about drawing a box around what you want to be CMMC certified. However, it's very easy for an organization to miss, forget, overlook some particular parts of their system. So that's why I usually encourage organizations to do a full inventory of all of their systems as part of the first part of the scoping process. And then by doing that, when you are drawing your box around that part of the environment you want in scope, you can then use that inventory to validate, am I overlooking an asset? Did I forget about something? Maybe there was some CUI that was only temporarily on a machine and you didn't think about it when you were initially drawing your box. But by going back to your inventory and pretty much going through every asset in your inventory, you're able to really double check and validate that all of that stuff is properly in scope. And then part of that scoping, and Anna mentioned that scoping is a data-centric process, and CMMC is very much data-centric. It's all about the data. It's all about CUI, controlled and classified information. So we want to determine where CUI exists in your system. And CUI could come from a number of different places. Number one, was there CUI received from the government? Was CUI created by the contractor? Is any CUI handled by employees? Is there any CUI shared with third parties? And what CUI is delivered to the government? So there are many places in which CUI can live in an organization. And we want to focus on the data. It's all about the data when we are talking about scoping. And then we want to identify the corresponding assets. Assets can be people, technology, facilities, or external providers. So when we're looking at CUI, when we're looking at these assets and different asset types, we want to make sure we're taking into account people, technology, facilities, and external providers. They are all subject to the assessment. People are the employees, contractors, vendors, and external service provider personnel. Fairly straightforward. Technology, they could be servers, client computers, mobile devices, firewalls, VoIP devices, VMs, database systems. Those are all considered technology when it comes to CMMC. And then facilities. There might be physical office locations. They might be individual offices. They may be part of a particular plant. It could be a secured room, etc. And then you have external service providers. Those are the external people, technology, or facilities that the organization uses. They could be a cloud provider. They could be a co-located data center, hosting providers. And one of the things that CMMC brings about, I can tell you years ago when I was doing assessing, there was a time in which the contractors I was assessing would outsource work, and for some reason they got it in their mind, and the government, quite frankly, wasn't up to speed with um, the idea of this outsourcing, and these contractors would outsource to a third party to provide, I don't know, their SOC services or to provide sysadmin capabilities. And these contractors would say, oh, when I would go in there and assess, the contractors would say, oh, it's not my problem. I outsource to someone else. So it's not applicable. CMMC does not allow that. It doesn't matter who is doing the work. If you have an external service provider, and they very well might be in scope for an assessment. So external service providers are very much considered just an asset, just like anything else. So we have the asset categorization. I talked about there are 5 different categories, 5 different asset types. The asset types are what's called CUI assets, security protection assets, contractor risk managed assets, specialized assets, and out of scope assets. Now, I'm going to get to them all in the next slides. But these are the 5 different asset categories that when you are scoping, I mentioned earlier about having an inventory of all your assets. part of that inventory should frankly be a column in which you specify what type of CMMC asset category is it. So I'm going to go to this is a table in the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Scoping Guide. I know a lot of times the documentation could get a little dry. It could get a little hard to read. I can tell you that in the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Scoping Guide, it has this table, and this table is very, very good. I think it's very easy to understand, and it really brings to light the idea of CMMC being a data-centric model. So I'm going to go through these different items in the table. So you can see here, the first column is the asset category. So those are those asset types or the asset category, what we're going to label them as. And then there is the asset description, the OSA requirements. So the requirements, if you're a contractor, what are you expected to do regarding that asset when it comes to CMMC? And then the last column is the assessment requirements. What are the requirements that assessor is going to go in there with? So the first thing is a CUI asset, a controlled unclassified information asset. Now, a CUI asset is any asset that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. So again, this is all about the data. If you have an asset that is handling CUI, that would be considered a CUI asset. Now, what are the requirements for a CUI asset? Number one, it needs to be documented in the inventory of that asset. So we can't be sweeping that asset under the carpet. It needs to be documented in the system security plan or the SSP. The SSP is a required document when it comes to CMMC. So that asset needs to be inventoried. It needs to be documented. It needs to be documented in the network diagram of that scope. So part of a CMMC assessment is you're required to have a network diagram. So it needs to be in that network diagram, and that contractor needs to be prepared that that asset is going to be assessed against all 110 CMMC security requirements. And then that last column, any CUI asset, as far as the assessment is concerned, is going to be assessed against all the CMMC security requirements. Then we have a security protection asset. A security protection asset is an asset that provides security functions or capabilities to the CMMC assessment scope, irrespective or whether or not the assets process, store, transmit CUI. So a security protection asset might be something like a firewall. It might be a SIM. It might be your SOC. It could be your domain controller, right? Any of these things are providing security functions or security capabilities to your scope. Even though it's not handling CUI, regardless if it's handling CUI or not, if it's protecting these CUI assets, then what happens is it needs to be documented in the asset inventory. It needs to be documented in the SSP. It needs to be documented in the network diagram, and it needs to be prepared to be assessed against all of the CMMC security requirements. And to the assessment, yes, it's going to be assessed against CMMC security requirements. So again, you have CUI assets, assets that handle CUI directly, security protection assets, assets that are responsible for protecting those assets. Now, a little bit of a heads up. Anna mentioned briefly that the final rule was posted on Tuesday. Was that yesterday? It was posted on Tuesday, the final rule. There have been, and you may want to read up some, maybe we'll have a webinar on the differences in the final rule and what came about in the final rule. But there are some minor, but actually significant changes. So everything we're going to be going through is going to be 90% on par with the final rule. There was a handful of things which there were some minor changes, but again, they do make some significant impact. One of them, for example, is security protection assets. I mentioned The assessment requirements is they're assessed against the CMMC security requirements. Before the final rule, it basically said that it's going to be assessed against all 110 security requirements. The final rule actually changed one word, and the final rule actually says assess against relevant CMMC security requirements. So it does open up a little bit to allowing the assessor to determine, all right, there might be some of the 110 security requirements that are not relevant. So they won't be assessed against those particular ones. So that's an example of there were some minor changes. They do make a significant impact, but everything we're talking about to you, they're going to be very small changes and very easy to understand. So in the final rule, it's going to be assessed against relevant CMMC security requirements, which lowers the bar a little bit. And then we have contractor risk managed assets. Those are assets that can, but are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI because of security policy, procedures, and practices in place. So you might have some assets that are on your network and they're not supposed to be handling CUI. They're not intended on handling CUI. If you have an asset that's not intended on handling CUI, but they are not physically or logically separated from CUI assets, meaning they are sitting on the same network as CUI assets, but they're not intended on handling CUI. Then they need to be documented in the asset inventory, documented in the SSP, documented in the network diagram, and they need to be prepared to be assessed against CMMC requirements. However, they don't have to be assessed against the CMMC security requirements. If the organization has the proper policy, procedures, and practices in place for an asset that's not intended on handling CUI, then as long as that asset is documented appropriately, they actually don't need to be assessed, and they will not be assessed against CMMC. So again, you have these assets that are not intended on handling CUI, and you're making sure that you have the proper policies and procedures in place that that they're not touching CUI. Then as long as they are documented sufficiently, they won't be assessed. They're still, to be crystal clear, they are still in scope, but they are not assessed. And this is where some people get confused because they think anything that's in scope for level 2 assessment means they are going to be assessed. No, you very well may have things like a contractor risk managed asset that is in scope, but it's not assessed. And then you have specialized assets. Specialized assets are assets that can process, store, or transmit CUI. So these assets very well might be handling CUI, but they can't be fully secured because they're one of 5 different asset types or specialized asset types. They're Internet of Things devices, IoTs, industrial Internet of Things, IIoT, operational technology, government furnished equipment, restricted information systems, or test equipment. So any of these types of assets, and I'll get to it in the next slide. If the government, for example, is forcing you and telling you you need to use Windows 95, that would be a specialized asset because the government is telling you how an asset needs to be configured or what asset you need to have. If you have Internet of Things, things like your smart thermostats, right? Your smart lights, those are considered Internet of Things. Those are specialized assets. Operational technology are things like your SCADA type systems, your CNC machines, 3D printers, any of that type of stuff is considered operational technology. Those are specialized assets. If you have a specialized asset, it needs to be documented in the asset inventory, documented in the SSP, It needs to be documented in the network diagram, but those specialized assets also are in scope, but they are not assessed against CMMC security requirements. And then you have out of scope assets. Out of scope assets are not in scope. They're not in scope for the assessments. There are assets that cannot handle CUI. They don't provide any security protection for CUI assets. They are not they are physically or logically separated from CUI assets. So they're not sitting on the same network as the CUI assets. They are physically and logically separated, and they are not handling CUI. If that's the case, then they are considered an out of scope asset, and they are not in scope, and they are not going to be assessed against the security requirements. So to quickly kind of summarize this, those CUI assets are in scope, and they are in scope because they either process, store, or transmit CUI. Those assets need to be fully documented, and they are assessed against all the CMMC requirements. Another thing that's in scope is security protection assets. They are providing security functions or capabilities. Because of that, they're going to be documented in the inventory, documented in the SSP, documented in the network diagram. And going back to the different types of assets, people, technology, or facilities, this slide is giving an example of people could be consultants that provide cybersecurity service. Technology could be a SIM solution or a hosted VPN service, all the way to facilities. You might have a SOC. You might have a co-located data center. All of these are examples of things that could be a security protection asset. Security protection assets are going to be assessed against all relevant CMMC requirements. And then contractor risk managed assets. Again, these are assets that are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI. So Bob, you did ask that they're not touching CUI. Does this mean they're not capable of touching CUI or only avoiding CUI access based on policy? Really avoiding CUI, and again, not intended on handling CUI. Technically, you can stick CUI on anything. Really, you could literally have a blank piece of paper sitting on your desk, right? And somebody could break in, some weird bad guy could break into your office and write CUI with a paper and pen on your blank paper. Technically, that's now CUI, but it's not intended on handling CUI. So yeah, as part of the normal operational aspect, it doesn't handle CUI. And again, it's not intended on handling CUI. And you're doing something a little bit more. You have a little bit of a compensating control, something, whether it's policy, controls in place to try to make sure that CUI is not on that asset. Now, when it comes to the actual assessment, the assessor can do what's called a limited spot check to make sure that, you know what, you say this is not intended on handling CUI. Is it really? And they're allowed to do a very limited spot check to make one that doesn't really affect or increase the scope of the assessment or the impact of the assessment, but they can verify that is this really not intended on handling CUI. And then, come on, you have specialized assets. Specialized assets, so contractor risk managed assets are not intended on handling CUI. Specialized assets, very well, they may have CUI, they may not have CUI. It actually doesn't matter. And those are the different Internet of Things devices and industrial Internet of Things your devices, your smart devices, your operational technology, your CNC machines, plasma cutters, all that type of stuff. Government furnished equipment. If the government is providing you equipment, well, that's a government equipment. You're not responsible for that. Restricted information systems, those are things, again, that the government tells you how something needs to be configured. So you really don't have any say in the configuration. And lastly, test equipment. So your oscilloscopes, your other types of test equipment, that's also considered a specialized asset. It needs to be fully documented. You should have some sort of compensating control to make sure that we're doing something a little bit above and beyond to protect that asset. But if all that is happening, then it's not going to be assessed. Whoops. Then we have out of scope assets. Those are assets that, again, they cannot process, store, transmit CUI. They don't provide security protections, and they need to be physically or logically separated from CUI assets. So you can't, if you have an asset that is sitting on the same network as a CUI asset, it would not be considered out of scope. It would have to be on a separate network. If you have an out of scope asset, as far as to me, the assessor, it doesn't exist. There's no documentation requirements for an out of scope access asset. Now, an organization may make sense for them to prepare to justify the inability of an out of scope asset to store, process, or transmit CUI. I can tell you from an assessor's point of view, if a contractor says to me, all of this stuff is in scope, I'm usually not going to question it. I'm going to say, okay, that's where you want your box. But the things that raise a yellow flag for me, an assessor, is when a contractor says, oh, this is out of scope. That's the stuff that usually raises the flag, and it's going to make me kind of double check and validate that. So you should be able to prepare to justify why something is out of scope. If something is out of scope, it is not part of a CMMC level 2 assessment. As far as me, the assessor, is concerned, it doesn't exist. An out of scope asset is no different than that cash register on the Wendy's 5 miles down the road. It doesn't exist in terms of the assessment. Here's a little picture of a sample CMMC assessment scope, and where you may have a contractor, that contractor may have an external service provider, and between the two of them, there might be some CUI assets, contractor risk managed assets. There might be some security protection assets, and you can see here in red is out of scope assets, right? So there might be some assets that are completely out of scope. So part of that scoping should be to draw what's called a scoping or a boundary diagram, where you have a diagram where that clearly indicates what assets are in scope, what assets are out of scope, and for assets that are in scope, the different asset category types. So some best practices that I usually suggest to organizations in terms of what they should do, keep in mind, and I'm hoping a lot of today's webinar kind of underscored how much it's a data-centric model. It is all about the data. Determining what's CUI, what's a security protection asset, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to identify that sensitive information, determine the data type, determine the asset type, and follow the information. One of the unsung heroes of CMMC that it's not very clear to a lot of people that CMMC brings about is CMMC is really trying to force the understanding and the consciousness to contractors of where their CUI is. And a lot of people don't realize that in being conscious of exactly where your CUI lives in your environment, because it is that CUI that DoD is trying to protect. So we want to determine how that information flows. We want to define those boundaries, and we want to make sure we're going to be assessing external providers, cloud service providers, potentially might be as in our scope, and either subcontractors and vendor connections. One of the things that comes to scoping, I mentioned earlier, if you have a subcontractor yourself, whether you're the prime and you're a sub, or you're a sub already and you may have your own subs, there are what's called flow down provisions. So if you have CUI and you're giving CUI to somebody else, that other organization, that other contractor also needs to meet CMMC requirements. So if all these requirements flow down. And again, lastly, you probably want to consult with the experts. Scoping, again, I have seen time and time again, will make or break an organization being able to actually achieve certification. If you draw the wrong box, you very well could be behind the 8 ball in terms of getting certification. And I've had company organizations that went from a potential certification that was going to be undoable to we applied the right scoping and it became a piece of cake and a walk in the park. So go ahead, Anna. Oh,
I
so that's
apologize.
all I have. Go ahead, Anna.
I apologize. I had to unmute myself. So just I want to, just before we go to questions, I want to do a quick announcement. And thank you so much, Mark, for this explanations. It was very helpful and I hope very beneficial to everybody on this webinar. I did forget to mention to everyone in the beginning that if you do have questions, please put them in your questions. Just send them on towards our way, and we will answer anything that is out there. But before we go to the questions, I want to make a quick announcement that CONNSTEP will be hosting a CMMC bootcamp training with myself and Mark Mousson in January of 2025. It will be a 5 half-day sessions or so, where we will be guiding the participants through all of the 110 security controls of the NIST 800-171. We'll discuss the implementation, the evidence, documentation. We'll talk through policy, system security plan, incident response plan, risk management, scoping. Yes, we will include discussion on scoping documentation and how to answer questions, how to do the proper scoping. The registrations will be opening shortly, and please check the CONNSTEP website soon for dates and registrations. Or if you need immediate assistance, you can reach out to us directly. So let me go to questions now. Lauren, are there any questions in the other?
No, Anna, there are not. The one question submitted, Mark was able to answer already for us.
All right, perfect. I do have a question for you, Mark, if that's all right.
Sure.
You did talk about external service provider, cloud service providers. I know just working with clients, there's always a big confusion, especially now with the new requirements. There's always a question about what are the requirements when it comes, the CMMC requirements when it comes to the external service provider and the cloud service provider, and what is the difference between those two, if you can talk
Sure.
about.
Sure. And it's interesting because the final rule, of course, changed things last minute on us. So it's a timely question because what they used to say is a little bit different than what's official as of now. So there are two different types of potential external providers. There is an external service provider and there is a cloud provider. It used to be that CMMC said anybody that's an external provider, as far as they were concerned, they are a cloud provider. So you had a lot of third party, just like break fix types of managed service providers that were suddenly being treated as a cloud provider from DoD. And that's a problem because cloud providers, when it comes to CMMC, if you're a cloud provider, they need to have something called FedRAMP certification, FedRAMP moderate certification, which is a pretty high bar. So if you're using something like AWS or Azure or something like that, you need to make sure that, or Office 365, Microsoft Office, you need to make sure it's FedRAMP compliant. So a cloud provider for CMMC has this FedRAMP requirement. an external service provider. So one of the things that they had just changed, and we're talking as of Tuesday, one of the things they just changed is they said, okay, they're not saying every external provider is considered a cloud provider, and therefore they need to meet FedRAMP. NIST has a document, NIST 861, no. NIST has NIST 80145 actually has a definition of what a cloud provider is. So it's a document that NIST has. And what CMMC just said as of Tuesday is, okay, they're going along with NIST's definition of a cloud provider. So a cloud provider is typically, if you were to look up NIST 80145, it's only like 3 pages long, but it's a fairly straightforward what we think of really in the real world as a cloud provider. Your AWS is your software as a service or infrastructure as a service type providers. So the good thing is, so we now have a line in the sand saying a cloud provider needs to be FedRAMP, and this is a definition of a cloud provider. External providers, there are two different potential types of external providers. An external provider that is handling CUI, or an external provider that is not handling CUI, but they might be handling security protection assets or security protection data. So in either case, a external provider, so again, maybe it's a sysadmin, or you have an outsourced SOC that's providing personnel augmentation. They will be essentially pulled into an assessment. So again, you don't get a free pass if you're using an external provider saying, oh, I have an outsourced SOC, I'm good. No, all 110 questions, they're going to be asked those CMMC assessment questions. They're going to potentially be pulled into the scope of that contractor. So the assessor is going to go and be asking them all the relevant questions. So that's one thing that could happen. The other thing that could happen is that external provider could themselves voluntarily get CMMC certification. And what that does is it's going to make it easy for that external provider because, they're not going to be pulled into an assessment every week to show proof that they're meeting all the requirements. In either case, they're going to be they're going to need to meet the requirements. But the main idea behind it is if they get that certification, it's going to be a lot easier than every single time they get pulled into an assessment. So that's kind of the big difference between the third-party providers and cloud providers. Cloud providers are required to have FedRAMP certification. A normal external provider that's not a cloud provider is going to be pulled in scope. If they have if they're handling CUI, they be considered a CUI asset, and they're going to be assessed against all requirements. If they're simply providing security functions and they are not handling any CUI, they're going to get pulled into the assessment, and they're going to be assessed against all relevant practices. And again, in either case, they could get CMMC certification voluntarily and make their lives easier.
Awesome. I was just wondering, I know we talked about the final rule being published. Can you give us your, I know that we all now, discussing, going through it, trying to figure out what are the new changes, what is important, what is, critical to know as it was published. Can you give us your summary and maybe a few points on something to keep in mind with the new rule and the changes?
Yeah, so again, they made a bunch of changes, again, minor changes, but that means a lot, with the security protection assets, assessing against all requirements versus relevant requirements. So they made a handful of them. They did a lot of clarification. If anyone can ever gets insomnia and you can't fall asleep at night, I encourage you, pull up that final rule and crawl in bed and read it, because number one, you'll be asleep in 5 minutes. And It does. Probably 3/4 of the final rule actually has a list of public questions that came in and their answers, and it provides actually a lot of clarification. One of the other clarifications on to get super technical is they provide a lot of information about if you have a VDI or virtual desktop. So let's say you're remoting in using some sort of VDI type of technology, remote desktop type of technology. There always was a question is your laptop that's VDI remotely connecting in to a VDI infrastructure, is your laptop in scope or not? So they actually did some really good clarification on that. And they essentially said, no, if if that laptop is really only transmitting keyboard presses, mouse and keyboard, and displaying what that VDI is showing, then that would be considered out of scope. Until now, it was a contractor risk managed asset. Some other changes they made, again, these are kind of small, but they have a big impact. For those of you that have worked with CMMC a little bit, the CMMC practices, they changed up some of the identifiers, some of the practice numbering. So especially for level 1, they renumbered them pretty much. Again, it really doesn't mean a lot. It's a minor change. It has a big impact because now we have to call things a different name, but it doesn't change the overall intent or really what's going on in terms of CMMC. They did move a handful of practices, a handful, maybe 2. I haven't really necessarily gone through a ton of it, but we identified at least 2 practices. Then they moved from level 1 to level 2. So there were some level 1 that they simply moved over to level 2. I think that's all I can think off the top of my head. There is one page in the final rule of the changes that they made, and there's probably only a dozen of things that they documented that were changes. One of them is clearly defining what's a cloud provider. The other one is defining requirements for VDI. Another one is the security protection assets. They did introduce a new term called security protection data. So you'll see that a lot if you even go through the scoping guide and the assessment guides that they just published, so you don't need to wade through the final rule. They do introduce a term of security protection data. Security protection data is data that is relevant to a security protection asset.
So just system logs.
Yeah, system logs, configuration information for a security protection asset. Things like that.
Just by the way, for everybody on this webinar, that link that Lauren shared with you in chat will take you to the updated documentation that Mark just referred to. And I have one final question for you, Mark, if you don't mind. So since the final rule came out, I have the last few days had lots of discussions with clients. Now that we have a set dates, and they know that they have to start planning ahead and figuring out the timings and the costs of actually assessment. Can you talk a little bit about what are they, just so the clients, our the contractors can start planning and get some maybe set their expectations correctly. What would you say about how much time, or what should be the time before the assessment itself? How much ahead of time they need to engage with a C3PO organization for the assessment, and how long the assessment itself will perhaps may take, and then maybe any cost or any information they can share with us in those aspects.
Sure. And there are a couple of pieces there. And I'll actually start out even before that, which is having people understand what's the timing of the CMMC requirements. So the timing of the CMMC requirements, so the rule is final technically right now. Technically speaking, DoD could launch a contract today with the CMMC requirements. Now, with that said, and again, I haven't gone through the final rule with a fine-tooth comb, but I can tell you from the proposed rule, there were 4 phases when it comes to CMMC. So they're saying there's 4 phases. Phase 1 is essentially where CMMC level 1 is going to be required. We're looking, technically it could be today type of thing, but more likely I think they're giving a little bit of a leeway, and it's probably going to be spring, probably like April of next year. That's going to be CMMC level 1. That's phase 1. Phase 2, now in the proposed rule, they said phase 2 is going to happen 6 months after phase 1. So if we're talking around April-ish, don't quote me on the date for phase 1, phase 2 would be around October-ish of next year. Phase 1 is essentially CMMC level 1 requirements. Phase 2 is essentially CMMC level 2 requirements. So we're talking about October roughly of next year where it's going to be actually in contracts as a requirement. With that said, I heard a rumor. I didn't necessarily read it in the final rule yet. I haven't gotten to it. That 6 month they changed to 1 year. So it could be April of next year. But again, it could start as early as, for example, now in October. So it could be phase 1 is this October, and phase 2 could be next October. So that's the rough timeline. So we're talking, I'd say, roughly October of next year to April of 2025 for CMMC level 2 requirements. With that said, and then phase 3 is CMMC level 3 requirements, which is 1 year after that. Now, as far as the time, on one hand, oh, great, we have a year. Well, I've seen most organizations, now it depends on their scope, but between a good 8 to 12 months of readiness to get their systems ready and compliant with CMMC. So we're talking about, if you were to start today, you're going to probably finish just in time with just getting your systems ready. The next thing is contacting a C3PAO. Now, there are not nearly as many C3PAOs or assessors as DoD wants at all. So, I think they only have like 30% the number of C3PAOs that their goal is. So there is going to be, and there is now, a huge rush to get these C3PAOs scheduled. So even though you might be ready a year from now, you might be on a waiting list for 3 to 6 months. And then the assessment is probably going to take somewhere between 12 weeks to so between 8 weeks to 12 weeks, something like, or 6 to 12 weeks. It does depend. So somewhere between a month and a half to like 3 months could be the actual assessment depending on scope. So we're talking about people being behind the 8 ball if they were to start today for this stuff going, being actually in contracts next year.
Wow. But this is very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing with us all that information. And I hope this was very helpful to everyone on the webinar as well. Again, everybody, you can see our phone number and for CONNSTEP, and you please reach out. You can go contact us through our website, CONNSTEP website as well. Please reach out if you have any questions, follow-up questions, or need assistance at any level with anything that you may need. So the CMMC is coming. It's in here. It's very exciting in many ways for many people. But thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for your time. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.